Once again, I'm Zach Ralston, Training and Support Specialist for ASC Web Services.
Oh, yeah.
So getting right into it, what's a wireframe? Wireframes are sketches or diagrams that help designers visualize and plan the layout, content, and structure of a website. Wireframing is a method that, more importantly, involves answering a lot of questions before you actually go into the building of the website, such as what are you going to display on the website and what information should you prioritize. So there are a few steps to a wireframe. Depending where you go, you might find a number of different steps, but I went with these 4 steps because they're typically the most consistent ones available. So the first part of a wireframe is the planning. This is kind of where we're getting all of our content together, thinking about the questions such as who is going to be using my website, what's the role of my website going to be, what's the purpose, things like that. The second part is where we start to pull our content together. That is a matter of determining what content do we have, what content do we need, and we start to gather basically our building materials for our wireframe. Then we get the sketch, which is kind of where we get to the actual wireframing in of itself. This is where we're drawing the layout and the diagram of what's going to be like the blueprint of our web page. And then we get to what's called make, or this goes by other names too, such as like the product or the prototype. Typically, when it comes to websites like these, it's going to be a little bit more of a prototype, if anything, but we'll get to that point later. So a little bit more detail about our first stage here, which is like the planning stage of your wireframe. And this is where we start to consider things like the goal for the web page or the overall purpose, what we want users to accomplish while they're on the website. We also consider our audience. Who is that going to be? So if we're designing the landing page for a school or a college, we're probably going to be thinking more in terms of current or potential students. So that's going to determine things like what information are we going to prioritize and things like that. If we're designing a web page for something like an academic journal, then we're probably going to be prioritizing or highlighting information on our website that's going to be more of interest to researchers, academics, faculty members. This is also where we start to think about what kind of content are we going to need for our web page. If we're going to need content such as multimedia, videos, links to journal entries, archives, things like that. We can also think in terms of classes. If we want our content to be links to course pages, what we're offering per semester, those kind of things. And the purpose of the page, which is where we're thinking in terms of task. What is the user going to be most likely doing? How can we perhaps get them to accomplish that task most effectively here? The second stage of coming up with your wireframe is where we start to pull the content together. This is before we get to any sketching or any diagrams or anything like that. So this is kind of considering what content we have available, like if you're designing the front page of a college, then you might want to think about some promotional material, things like how to apply for your website, course pages, faculty, resources, those kind of things can be all considered content. But content can also be things like what kind of images are you going to use? Are you going to upload any PDFs? Are you going to use any videos, audio files, all those kind of things? Those are part of the content page. And it's also where we're going to think of terms of the hierarchy of your content. What is going to be the first content that a visitor sees on your website? Is it going to be your undergraduate and graduate programs pages? Is it going to be anything sports related? Those kind of things. Third stage here is when we actually get to the wireframing itself, the sketch phase. And this can be done pretty much just on basic pen and paper. This is essentially just drawing the diagram, visualizing the layout. There's a bunch of apps that you can use that can kind of help with this phase, such as Adobe XD, Figma, Mach Plus. But for the most part, the easiest and most cost-effective way to go about this is essentially just relying on pen and paper. This way, you don't necessarily need to have this kind of skill with an Adobe Creative Suite app, for example, or any of these other apps. This is a matter of just kind of getting the visuals down and using it as the model for when you're actually designing your web page. And the last stage is what, again, we call make. This goes by a lot of different names too: prototype, product, things like that. But this is where we essentially create the mock-up of the actual page. You could do this on Drupal. You could use anything like filler text, links, and this is kind of where we assess if what we have down is actually going to accomplish the needs that we planned out in the previous stage, if it meets the goals that we determined earlier on in the wireframe process. So when we're applying the wireframes to the Drupal standard sites, this is where we start to kind of think in terms of rows, or the more technical side of Drupal, because the interface that we're working with is essentially very top-down. So we tend to think in terms of these rows, especially when it comes to your advanced layout section. In addition to your advanced layout section, above, you have your slideshow area, along with the main body text field as well. And these kind of form a sort of structure to your web page. So it really helps to think in terms of a top-down approach when you're working with the rows. And this also lets you consider which information you're going to prioritize on your web page and where it's going, which role it's going to occupy on the web page. So some things to remember when you're thinking in terms of your wireframe, or you're planning out your wireframe, are your columns. For your landing pages, there are a total of 4 column types, which can get pretty crowded. And on your basic page, you have like a maximum of 3 columns as well. Columns that generally have less content that they need to squeeze in and share, like your 1 or your 2 columns, these are going to be better for your more prioritized content and information. So this is kind of where, if you're designing that landing page for your school, you're probably going to be using those spaces for undergraduate programs, graduate programs, academics, your about pages, those kind of things. Whereas when we start to kind of go down the row and we're starting to see more column content types, your 3 and your 4 column contents, that's when things are starting to get smaller and they're kind of competing for space at that point. It's all evenly spread out, but at the same time, it's still not going to be as prominent as with your 1 or your 2 columns. So those are things to keep in mind when you're applying the wireframes to your website. So this is where we're actually going to go through a very brief walkthrough of a wireframe sketch that I went through to develop a landing page. All I needed to do was just grab a pencil and paper, and I created a sketch for everything that you're going to see here. And this essentially plans out the steps of how I designed this particular wireframe. So to start with, I just drew just a rectangle, and I wanted to make sure that there were spaces marked for my header, my contact space, and my footer at the very bottom of the page. There's really no wrong way to go about this, but I designed this in a way to kind of also encourage you to think more in terms of the rows and the hierarchy of content. So I created 4 empty rows or strips, and they essentially provide the structure of the content. So the very first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to imagine this as the landing page for a school or a college. So the thing that I wanted to prioritize the most, the very first thing I wanted them to see, other than just a welcome message, were links to the undergraduate programs and the graduate programs of this fictional school. Going down, I wanted to provide a little bit more information that a potential student might be interested in. I wanted to include 3 advanced callout boxes that not only provide enough visual space for my about page, my newsletter page, and outreach related stuff, but also I wanted to have text to complement that, to provide just a little bit more information before directing potential visitors to those pages. And on my 3rd row here, I decided that I wanted to put information about my college that might not be the most urgent or important information, but I still wanted to give it enough space. So I decided to go with 3 regular call-out boxes for facilities, an alumni community, and our giving page in case anyone wants to become a donating alumni. And the 4th row, to kind of make things not just be a wall of call-out boxes on my page, I also decided to include a brief YouTube video and a Twitter feed that can post live updates while also not essentially taking up too much space on the website. And this is the point where we're actually done with the sketch phase of the wireframe. So I'm going to show you now a quick test page that I built with this wireframe that is part of the mockup. It's part of the product. So we'll go straight to that. So as you can see, I have my undergraduate programs and my graduate studies programs, just as I wanted. It's the very first thing that they're going to see. I have my filler text here just to give you an impression of how these callout boxes are going to look like, that when we actually provide that very basic information, such as the about page, the newsletter, and our outreach efforts. And the less prioritized information or less prioritized pages that I built are going to have their own space here, facilities, alumni community, giving. And this is also where we have more of our multimedia, such as our YouTube video, basically advertising what life is like in Columbus, and a live Twitter feed that is connected to the ASC Tech Twitter. And essentially, that pretty much is it. We covered very briefly the steps of the wireframe process, the actual sketching of a wireframe, and the mock-up portion of that. So that actually concludes the training portion of the wireframe, but we also wanted to include some pretty exciting updates I'm pretty happy to talk about. Some of you wanted a way to hide the Google map that would occasionally appear on your user profile when you filled out your work location, so the room and building and the street address. That would usually prompt Google Maps to pinpoint that. So we now have a hide Google Map feature that's just a simple checkbox. You can it gives you the option to hide or show that map if you want. So you have a bit more control with that now in your profile. In addition to that, we also created the pronoun text field. This is kind of like a way to communicate to anyone visiting the website what pronouns you prefer to be addressed by. I personally go by he, they. I'm not really particularly picky. Just so long as I know you're referring to me, we're good. But yeah, that is something that's available to all our users now. And lastly, we want to share some resources with you. We have a Drupal standard websites teams on Microsoft Teams that you're free to join. This is a great way to get any updates, anything Drupal or ASC related. It's also a good way to communicate with one another. It's also a good way to ask about anything design related too. And it's kind of a more streamlined way of communicating with me. If you have any questions, if you don't want to wait through email or ticket, I would definitely welcome you to join that team. It's goofosu.edu/DSS. There is also the Web Services Knowledge Base. This is a great resource that we are always kind of building and adding on to. It's also where we upload recorded versions of these presentations after we're done. And it's also a great reference in case you forget anything. I was using this actually quite a bit when I first started, and it's kind of stuck with me since. So I personally found this to be a great resource, and that's at u.osu.edu/ASC web. And lastly, we have the Advanced Layout Showcase. And this is a pretty great resource that gives you a good idea of what you can potentially do with your web pages. It's literally a showcase of most features available in your Advanced Layout Showcase. And it shows all the kinds of different things you can do in your different column content, such as your 1 columns, 2 columns, 3 columns, things like that. Twitter feeds, accordions, tabs, call out boxes, things like that.
To me, I kind of put it in the category of like when I go into the store and I see the clothing on the model, it's like, oh, that's all the possibilities. So I don't know. I'm hoping maybe it's helpful to other people as well.
Yeah, that's usually like the best thing to think about it in terms of it's the mannequin of sorts of all your different features that you could throw on there. And that is, again, go.osu.edu/AL showcase. But that said, that's the end of our presentation.